Sienna, God, hello all. It's good afternoon, Water. Thank you for watching. So I was like all wrapped up in this, and I was like, oh my God, I already went over the 20 minutes. So that's where the cutoff comes, and I'm just gonna reread that sentence. Oh, this is crazy town banana pants, y'all. Like, what the what? Okay, anyway. Such views were not confined to Northerners, however, nor to urban businesses. According to a noted history of the antebellum South, the Richmond Enquirer, and quotes, attributed the success of Northern farmers where Southerners had failed to the social nature of the latter, which led them to gather around the courthouse and country stores to smoke, chew, talk politics, and in general to waste time, end quote. Many Southern businessmen were unreliable about either paying their bills or delivering goods and services when promised. Among Southerners in general, their improvident spending and their indebtedness, to which it often led, was widely commented on the United States, and the places from which their ancestors came in Britain. Even large Southern plantation owners with lavish lifestyles were often deeply in debt. Among the Virginia gentry, quote unquote, extravagant, or I should say in quotes because it's a sentence or something, extravagant and even ruinous bets on horses were common, according to a scholarly study. Nor were Southerners alert to profitable investment prospects, according to observers of the antebellum South. For example, although there were large coal deposits and a quote unquote beautiful quality of marble near Tuscaloosa, Alabama, the people there bought coal from Philadelphia, and marble for tombstones was imported from Italy. In the antebellum Virginia as well, Olmsted observed the natural resources of the land were strangely unused, or were used with poor economy, end quote. Nor was he alone in that conclusion. A 20th century scholar also commented on the coal available in Alabama. The Alabama Iron District is one of the cheapest, if not the cheapest iron district in the entire world. It possesses a phenomenal natural equipment. Jutting out of the hillsides that flank one side of the broad open valley are thick deposits of iron ore. On the other side of the valley are the coal mines and coke ovens, and the limestone is at hand. Instead of carrying ore 1,000 miles as at Pittsburgh and the English furnaces, or fuel 600 miles as at Lake Champlain, the raw materials for these southern furnaces are shifted across the valley by switching engines, and the local supply of cheap black labor helps to give a wonderfully low cost. Yet it was more than 20 years after the Civil War before Birmingham became an iron and steel production center. As for the reasons for the belated development of such a promising combination of natural resources, in spite of the favors of geography, the iron and steel industry in the South was slow in its beginnings and development. Like everything Southern, the industry was retarded by lack of capital and technical skill. Capital was available from outside the South, or indeed from outside the country, as foreign capital was used to finance the building of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Illinois Central during the same era. But the other factors had to be there to create a promising prospect of profitability that would attract investment. The difficulties of developing those other factors in Alabama was shown by the fact that in 1888, in quotes, Birmingham saw its first ton of steel run through the furnaces of the Henderson Steel Company and burn out the crude furnace linings in the process, end quote. Early explorers and settlers in the antebellum South, end quote, wrote in glowing terms of the wild fruits, especially the wild grapes of unusual size, which excited extravagant hopes of the development of wine industries, end quote. Yet early attempts to find a market of southern wine in Britain were ruined by the fact that a sample of wine that was sent across the Atlantic spoiled in the musty casks in which Southerners had carelessly shipped it. What? Later efforts to establish a wine industry in the South were undertaken by foreigners, French, German, and Portuguese. A German settlement in Missouri created a wine industry with an annual output of about 100,000 gallons. But the South as a whole produced less than 1/5 of the wine in the United States in 1849, and this was long before the development of the California wine industry. And this is literally why they say, like, you can give the man the fish and then he's going to be dependent upon you to eat, or you can teach a man to fish and then he'll never need anything for the rest of his life, right? He won't need food. Like, what? But they have to be willing participants in their own success, right? Like, come on now. As late as the beginning of the 20th century, there were still laments about the opportunities in the South missed by Southerners and put to use by outsiders with different patterns of behavior. Landowners in Alabama were said to have, in quotes, cheated themselves out of millions of dollars by failing to see the opportunities within their grasp, end quote, which, in quotes, lumbermen from the north and east, end quote, seized by cutting trees and shipping the lumber around the world. Some Southerners along the Gulf Coast likewise spoke of the, quote, golden opportunities which they failed to grasp, of the numerous successes of northern and eastern men, and lamented the passing of the old school of gentlemen, the midday mint juleps, and the easy-going business methods, end quote. Some of these Southerners, however, seemed to prosper, in quotes, working shoulder to shoulder with the Yankees, end quote. Not only in the South, but in the communities from which white Southerners had come in the Scottish Highlands, in Ulster, and in Wales of an earlier era, most of the successful businessmen were outsiders. Even the poorest Highland Scots could not skin their horses when they died. Instead, in quote, Scots sold their dead horses for 3 pence to English soldiers, who in turn got 6 pence for the skinned carcass and another 2 shillings for the hide, end quote. Oh my gosh. This was not due to a lack of knowledge of skinning. In earlier times when Scotland and England were at war, one of the atrocities committed by the Scots was skinning captured English officers alive. During the 16th century border feuds, the, in quotes, Johnston-Johnson clan adorned their houses with the flayed skins of their enemies, the Maxwells, end quote. It was not the skill that was lacking, but the enterprise. Contemporary observers commented on another peculiarity of the antebellum Southerners: fording rivers and streams instead of building bridges over them. Nor was this due simply to poverty. A biography of famed 19th century Congressman John Randolph of Virginia referred to the quote-unquote bridgeless streams in the area where elite families like his lived. Thomas Jefferson noted that he had to cross 8 rivers between Monticello and Washington, in quotes, 5 of which had neither bridges nor boats, end quote. The peculiarity was noted in other parts of the South and by observers in those parts of Britain from which Southerners came. Commenting on just how lazy Southerners were, one man noted that, in quotes, no northern farmer, end quote, would neglect to build a bridge over a stream that crossed his property. Indeed, to quote unquote live Yankees would complete the work in a single day, but quote in quotes, the Southern planter will ford the creek lying between his house and stable a whole lifetime, end quote. The same complaint was made about Highland Scots, whose roads were equally bad as those of Ireland and the Old South. And I wonder if they complained about it when they were crossing it. You know what I'm saying? Oh, I gotta cross it again, going, you know what I mean? Instead of just building a bridge over it. In the 1790s, a minister, noting that the fords, rather than bridges, cross streams on one of the most heavily traveled roads in the Highlands, wrote, in quotes, from a desire to save labor or time, the ford is often attempted when the river is too high, and the consequence is frequently fatal, end quote. Again, it is necessary to emphasize the culture which Southerners brought over from the parts of Britain from which they came changed in Britain in the years after they left. But all this happened after the ancestors of rednecks and crackers had immigrated to the American South from the outer regions of British society rather than from central England. Intellectual activity. Given the historical background of crackers and rednecks in Britain, it could hardly be expected that intellectual activity would be a major interest of theirs in the United States. A study of 18,000 county records from 17th century colonial Virginia showed that nearly half of all the white male Virginians, in quotes, were so illiterate that they could not sign their names, end quote, and simply made a mark on legal documents. While the small Virginia aristocracy were often well educated and had an impressive collection of books in their homes, these books were typically imported from England rather than purchased from local bookstores. Thomas Jefferson complained that the area where he lived was, quote unquote, without a single bookstore. As late as the census of 1850, more than 1/5 of Southern whites were still illiterate compared to less than 1% of New Englanders. I don't know about you, but I never was taught that in school, right? It was always the blacks that were illiterate. Oh, they just didn't want you to read. They said you couldn't read, and all that, and you'd be punished or killed or whatever for reading. So I thought that it was just them, and then it was people who couldn't speak English when they came over, because quite naturally, they're only going to know the stuff that they came over with. They can't, you know what I mean? And there's going to be a language barrier there. So they're not going to be sitting there reading English books and stuff, right? So they would have to be taught how to read English, right? But what about the white people that came over? I always assumed they knew how to frickin' read and write, right? Like, come on. My God. Okay. And the southern backcountry levels of the schooling, in quotes, were lower here than in any other part of the United States, end quote. According to a landmark historical study, end quotes, there were no institutions comparable to New England's town schools, end quote. Although the white population in the South was only one half as large as that of the North, the total number of illiterate whites in the South in 1850 was larger than the total number of illiterates in the North. In the antebellum era, the total circulation of northern newspapers was more than 4 times the total circulation of southern newspapers. And I had to read that again. Like, that was just like, what? Did I read that right? I don't know. Moreover, many editors of southern newspapers were themselves from the North. The North had 4 times as many schools, attended by more than 4 times as many pupils. Okay, Mr. Matt, you're just going to have to go today. We're going to have to catch you and take you outside. Children in Massachusetts spent more than twice as many years in school as children in Virginia. When it came to inventions, only 8% of the patents issued in 1851 went to the residents of southern states, whose white population was approximately 1/3 of the white population of the country. Even in agriculture, the main economic activity of the region, only 9 out of 62 patents for agricultural implements went to Southerners. The cotton gin, perhaps the most crucial invention for the antebellum South, was invented by a Northerner. Come on. Nat, go on. A Southerner said to Frederick Law Olmsted, end quotes, "The fact is, sir, the people here are not like you, Northern people. They don't reason out everything so," end quote. Olmsted himself likewise concluded from his travels in the antebellum South that Southerners were, end quote, greatly disinclined to exact and careful reasoning, end quote. As late as the First World War, white soldiers from Georgia, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Mississippi scored lower on mental tests than black soldiers from Ohio, Illinois, New York, and Pennsylvania. At higher levels of achievement, the contrast between the South and other regions was even more stark. A study of leading American figures in the arts and sciences in the first half of the 19th century found most clustered in the Northeast, while vast regions of the South to Virginia, or it says South-Virginia alone accepted, were without a single one. Man. Huh. The kinds of statistical disparities found between Southern whites and Northern whites in the past are today often taken as evidence of proof of racial discrimination, when such disparities are found between the black and white populations of the country as a whole, while others have taken such disparities as signs of genetic deficiencies. Yet clearly neither racial discrimination nor racial inferiority can explain similar differences between whites in the North and the South in earlier centuries. This should at least raise questions about such explanations when applied to blacks of a later era who inherited the culture of white Southerners. What? And the people that had the abundance with their land, their cattle, their livestock, whatever, and then somebody else comes in and does something with it, like, oh, they took that from me. Like, what? But you weren't doing anything. Oh, they swindled me out of, you know what I mean? Like, come on. You ain't gonna do nothing with it anyway. There's no drive to do it. Sexual activity. Southern whites were as different from Northern whites when it came to sexual patterns as they were in other ways. Widespread casual sex was commented on by outside observers in both the American South and in those parts of Britain from which Southerners had come. Here again, the greatest contrast is with New England. While pregnant brides were very rare in 17th century New England, they were more common in the southern backcountry than anywhere else in the United States. A missionary estimated that more than 9/10 of the backcountry women at whose weddings he officiated were already pregnant. And this, as in other respects, the end quote, sexual customs of the southern backcountry were similar to those of northwestern England, end quote. Meanwhile, the region of England from which New Englanders came, end quote, had the lowest rates of illegitimacy in England, end quote, just as their descendants had the lowest rates of illegitimacy in the United States. Women dressed more revealingly in the South, and both sexes spoke more freely about sex than was common in New England. In the 17th century, end quotes, most Virginia girls found a husband by the age of 17, end quote, while in Massachusetts, the average age at which a woman married was 23. In that era, fornication and rape were acts severely punished in New England. Rape was a hanging offense in New England, while in the Chesapeake Bay colonies, it was sometimes punished less severely than petty theft. What? As with other north to south differences in sexual behavior have often been attributed to existence of slavery in the South, due to this case to the opportunities which this presented for sexual exploitation of slave women. But again, history shows the same patterns among the same people and their ancestors in Britain. Before they had ever seen a black woman in colonial Virginia as well, the sexual exploitation of white indentured servant girls was common before the slave population had grown large enough for white servant girls to be replaced by black women. Shut up. That's crazy. Okay. Did you hear that? Did you hear what I just freaking said? Oh my gosh. Listen at this. As with other north to south differences in sexual behavior have often been attributed to the existence of slavery in the South, due in this case to the opportunities which this presented for sexual exploitation of slave women. Okay, now here we go. But again, history shows the same patterns among the same people and their ancestors in Britain before they had ever seen a black woman. In colonial Virginia as well, the sexual exploitation of white indentured servant girls was common before the slave population had grown large enough for white servant girls to be replaced by black women. So when people are telling you, okay, that whites were enslaved too, and they're like, and it was blacks, right? Listen, do your due diligence in your research and use your discernment. Like, come on, okay? I didn't know this, now you know, so the more you know. Once you see this stuff and read this stuff for yourself, you can't freaking unread it, unsee it, unhear it, whatever it is. And you're gonna look at the world with a whole totally different new set of eyeballs and a new brain, right? Religion. Religious denominations, practices, and churches differed as between the crackers and rednecks of the South and those of the white population in the rest of the country. As in other things, the greatest contrast was with the role of religion in New England. This did not mean that there was uniformity across the South, for the Virginia elite tended to be Anglicans, and there were also Quakers in the South, for example, but most Southerners were either Baptists or Methodists. Those Northerners or foreigners who visited the South found the style and manner of religion among most white Southerners distinct and distasteful. These visitors, in quotes, viewed with contempt people who whooped and hollered, chewed and spit tobacco in church, end quote. Many Southern religious gatherings were not held in churches, but at outdoor, quote-unquote, camp meetings, a style that went back to the practices of these Southerners' ancient ancestors, in Britain. So too did the oratorical style of Southern preachers and the behavior of their congregations, whether in churches or outdoors. Frederick Law Olmsted's description of a typical preacher in the antebellum South noted that, in quotes, the speaker nearly all the time cried aloud at the utmost stretch of his voice as if calling to someone a long distance off, end quote. That, in quotes, he was gifted with a strong imagination and possessed of a good deal of dramatic power. That he had, in quotes, the habit of frequently repeating a phrase, end quote, and that he exhibited, in quotes, a dramatic talent that included leaning far over the desk with his arms stretched forward, gesticulating violently, yelling at the highest key, and catching his breath with an effort, end quote. And we'll leave it at that. Don't think I'll hate you any good chance. Okay, till we meet again. Love you, mean it.